thanks everybody. I'm very gratified that of a Friday, kind of blustery Friday afternoon, so many people have turned out to listen to a lawyer speaking about chemicals. So I am very gratified, because you never know what way these things will go. It's too niche, but it seems to have generated enough interest. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is something that's it's in your clothing, it's in your furniture, it's in your food, it's in your water, it's in your dental floss, your food packaging, your pizza containers, your makeup, your menstrual products. It's everywhere. It's in Arctic ice. It's 10 kilometers deep down in the Mariana Trench in the Pacific Ocean. It's thought to be present in the blood of almost every single human being on the planet. So I think, given we're all living in France, or we're all spending time in France, in Europe, UK, Ireland, US, we can probably assume, all of us in this room, that it's in our blood too. So I'm talking about per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which is catchy, but probably, as most of us know it's PFAS, or forever chemicals, is how most of us are probably familiar with this topic. So what are these PFAS and forever chemicals? They are a family of approximately 10,000 chemicals that are notoriously difficult to break down, hence the colloquial term forever chemicals. They take thousands and thousands of years to break down, biodegrade, they're hypermobile, they travel really far, they're extremely resistant. And they were first developed in the 1930s in a lab accident. Very interestingly, it was DuPont, of some notoriety now, which I'll come back to, was doing some lab experiments to improve refrigeration technology. Something went wrong in the lab, and basically this chemical emerged that was extremely resistant, that was heat resistant, it was water resistant, it was pliable. And they thought, actually, you know what, we're onto something here. That newly created chemical, which became known as Teflon, was then used in the Manhattan Project, which you'll be familiar with, to build the atomic bomb during World War II. And then after the war in the 1940s, this new kind of family of chemicals became really commercialized and made its way into consumer products. So Teflon non-stick pans was a big one, but as I've set out earlier, it's essentially in everything now. It became really commercialized then in the 1940s. These were seen as a complete revolution, a miracle product, and I found a really interesting article from a magazine called Popular Mechanics from 1952. And this is what they said about forever chemicals as they're known now, back in 1952. And I'm going to quote from this article. Consider, for example, the possibility of a lifetime lubricant sealed into your car engine, a house paint that just plain refuses to permit your home to burn down. Pots and pans that literally push away scorched food, detergents so effective a grease monkey's overalls will come clean in a few swishes. But of course, as we all know now, with the benefit of hindsight, there is a catch to all of this. And for the last few decades, there has been a growing consensus, a lot of scientific studies, peer-reviewed knowledge emerging on the health and environmental risks posed by these chemicals. So these peer-reviewed studies have demonstrated that what happens is the chemicals accumulate and attach to proteins in our blood. As we get older, it bioaccumulates in our bodies as it doesn't break down. So we can in small doses excrete it. Our liver does a lot of hard work with this, but actually just given the time and also recalling the fact that we're constantly ingesting this every day, it just does build up over time. And studies have found that it's linked to several cancers, ulcerative colitis, immunotoxicity, endocrine disorders, pregnancy-related hypertension, decreased fertility, cholesterol, the works. And I think it's quite interesting in the current climate, and we've seen it in the news very recently in France as well and elsewhere, about this concern in decreased fertility and not as many children being born as before. Obviously a lot of factors tying into that, but there are some concerns that perhaps all of these endocrine disruptors are actually interfering with people's reproductive health as well. So it emerged essentially through litigation in the early 2000s in a case which I'll go into some detail a little bit later, but it is famous DuPont litigation in the US of some Netflix Dark Waters film fame, in case any of you have seen that. DuPont making those resistant non-stick Teflon pans. And so through that litigation in the 2000s, there were some medical studies done just to see, were these products actually harming people's health? And that was when people started to become aware of the risks. But actually, that litigation revealed that DuPont itself had been aware in its own internal documents since the 1970s that these chemicals were causing harm, and that was a major scandal really in that litigation, given there were almost 3 decades of knowledge there internally that then came out through disclosure. So as Chris has pointed out, I'm a barrister, a trial lawyer, as I've just learned through Chris, thank you, that I would be referred to in the States. Most of my work is in England and in Ireland, and I have found over the past few years that the issue of PFAS and forever chemicals has really started to become a very live issue. And just before, I literally ran from a webinar this morning. It's really topical this week because the government in the UK has just published a PFAS action plan. So I was busy this morning talking about that. So this is really, really topical. And just in terms of how this is crossing my desk at the moment, I've had quite a bit of advisory work. So not live litigation, there hasn't been a case like that in the UK yet, but I'll come on to that, watch this space, might be one bubbling. A lot of advisory work. Companies are really confused. I'm speaking to a business audience today. Regulatory compliance is difficult, but when you're dealing with, I think, international regulatory divergence and people importing products, as I've seen in my advisory work, from Asia, trying to import it into the EU, but then also into the UK, and the difference of regulatory rules post-Brexit, really struggling with that. And Northern Ireland being an issue, because Northern Ireland follows the much more advanced EU PFAS rules. So a lot of sort of regulatory confusion there and difficulties in having to juggle with several regimes. I've been exploring a case recently. This is a case that I've mentioned. I can mention it. It's in the public domain. I'm instructed by firm solicitors in the UK. We're trying to see, causes of action that we could bring against a firefighting foam manufacturer in the north of England, who some environmental information requests done by the ENDS report, which is a really brilliant investigatory magazine based on a journal focused on environmental issues, has revealed that they found the highest level of PFAS pollution ever found in the UK in this area. And there's a lot of concern it's linked to the firefighting foam, which contains PFAS. And so we're looking at seeing, can we bring potentially a nuisance action there against that company. We're still very much exploring it. Local authorities as well have needed a bit of help looking at how they can update their contaminated land strategies to take into account PFAS, because local authorities in the UK, and I'm sure in France and in Ireland it's the same, they're similar with a few differences, have duties to investigate contaminated land and then to pinpoint somebody who's maybe responsible for that, or is the owner and occupier who's going to then remediate the land. So that's been very much on my agenda as well. And I've done some work in Ireland as well, advising claimants on a judicial review against a wastewater treatment plant. And a lot of the issues in that were around inadequate environmental assessments. And the issue I looked at was the extent to which forever chemicals were or were not, as the case may be, adequately fed into that environmental assessment. And that case settled back just in December, and environmental issues were really to the forefront of that. So, all of that to say, really, this is a really complex area of litigation, as I'm sure you'll appreciate from that whistle-stop tour. It's important to recognise, of course, that most industrial discharges are legal. They're done with the benefit of permits. So there's a whole environmental permitting regime in the UK that's managed by the Environment Agency. I'm sure it's similar in France. Most countries will have an environmental permitting regime that makes these industrial discharges legal on the face of things. But then I suppose it's the key difference is, where does a legal discharge then become illegal, particularly in a case like the UK and also like the EU, where things are trying to catch up to the science. The science is showing the harm, but the regulatory regimes might not necessarily have caught up to that. And so if an individual then is living in an area where there is a potentially industrial polluting body or company operating there, and there is some evidence emerging this is causing health issues, and maybe those people are feeling it themselves, there's a lot of complexity then between actually getting from that position of perhaps harm, but actually proving that harm, and that's linked to that company. And also, that's a classic issue you see in litigation around establishing causation. So you're dealing with prima facie legal discharges of industrial emissions, health issues that have to be directly sort of attributed in enough of a way that can establish causation in a legal sense. And the extra complexity is added to by the fact that, as you'll recall from the start of this talk, these are forever chemicals. They stay in the ground, they stay in the water. They've been used, as I said, since the 1930s. So if you're trying to look at, building a legal action against a company, a lot of companies will say, well, hang on, that wasn't us. That's legacy pollution. That's from the 1940s or the 1950s or the 1960s, but we phased out PFAS or certain types of PFAS. And so you're in a very difficult situation then of saying, whose pollution is this? And then the polluter pays principle comes into play, but who is that polluter? So that's a really difficult area to look at there. But interestingly, just to take a case study, there's a chemicals company in the north of England in Lancashire. It's called AGC Chemicals, and it's a Japanese parent company, and their subsidiary in the UK is one of the main chemicals manufacturers in Europe. And there have been some Environment Agency investigations, reports essentially with that company's cooperation just to help build up the UK's regime after Brexit. And there have been some concerns around the levels of PFAS being found in the surrounding area, and currently that's subject to a live investigation, a contaminated land investigation with the Environment Agency and the local authority. And what's really interesting about this, and I think really watch the space, is causation is less difficult to prove in this scenario because this company is the only importer in the UK of a chemical that's imported from Japan. They're the only importer of this chemical. So if that chemical is found, and if that chemical, and there are some suggestions in the WHO classifications that it actually might be really toxic and very dangerous, that one is one where it's easier to say it's that company, but it's usually very difficult. So I'm talking about how difficult it is. Turn to a success story now. I've mentioned briefly that US DuPont litigation. So this is a really interesting case. It is the pioneering case that started all of this. Basically, it's a US corporate defense lawyer, so a poacher turned gamekeeper example of a lawyer that worked for chemicals companies, and then had actually, I think from his hometown essentially, people coming to him saying, Rob, can you look into this? Our cattle are dying in the fields, they've got awful diseases, ulcers, there might be something to look into. So he took on that case, and he took on DuPont, who are making in that area the non-stick pans a lot was used today. And it was found actually over years and years and years that company had been polluting the groundwater and the land, and that was harmful. And how did it work? How did it go step by stage? Well, firstly, Rob Billett, the lawyer, and his clients had to prove that about 70,000 people there had been poisoned through exposure to PFOA, which is just one type of PFAS. And that was really difficult because at that time, there wasn't any public-facing information around health risks with this chemical. So the lawyers had to be extremely creative, and they were. They brought the claim in West Virginia. So they were very strategic about the forum and the state they brought the litigation in, because West Virginia provides for medical monitoring claims in its own jurisdiction. So they said, right, if we can get enough going here, we'll be able to get a medical monitoring program in place, and scientists will then actually test people's blood, and that will help build the evidence base. So that's what happened. Those blood tests took place, and the Environment Protection Agency then later stepped in as well and began its own investigation into the toxicity of PFOA. And so those findings then did reveal that there were potential human health risks, and it was tainting the drinking water, the grounds, people's vegetables, any agriculture in that region was affected. And as part of the settlement then, DuPont had to go and fund further blood tests, which then allowed personal injury actions to be taken. So a lot of spin-off litigation going on and on and on. And actually that litigation is still happening. It's taking slightly different forms now. And at the moment it's quite interesting and something I'm sort of quite alive to in the UK, given all the issues with water companies and the infrastructure not being up to date and storm sewage overflows and all. What's happening now is water companies in the US are considering taking actions against chemical companies for cleanup of their systems. So it's really interesting to see over decades how that has evolved. So will we see more of this litigation in Europe, in France, in the UK and Ireland? Absolutely. We're in France, so I'll give some examples from France. Just on the 12th of January, I think you'll all be relieved to hear after this quite gloomy talk, the EU has introduced limits on PFAS in drinking water. So cheers to that. We can all drink our water safely today, but perhaps not quite, because of course, monitoring has to happen to see what are the limits, and then measures will have to be taken to bring it within limits. But from the 12th of January, there are legally binding limits of PFAS in drinking water in the EU. So a lot of work will have to be done, of course, to comply with that. Just in January as well, France passed a law banning the production and import and use of any product which could have an alternative to PFAS that's been used in clothing, ski products, cosmetics. So France actually going further than the EU in that example. In the last year, there have been some really quite difficult and very headline-hitting issues in the Moselle region. There's the Bâle-Mulhouse airport there, and a lot of pollution in the area, and a drinking water ban essentially for months and months. And I'm not sure whether it's still ongoing, but for months people have been told you cannot drink your tap water. And in the Champagne-Ardenne region as well, there's a paper mill factory. And I won't go into the waste regime, but basically that paper mill factory can then use some of the paper waste and the sludge that comes from the manufacturing process, sell it on to agriculture, and then that being used in spreading on land as part of the fertilizers. And they found 10 kilometers away massive PFAS issues in that region, and they're wondering if it might be linked to the sludge that's sold on from that paper mill. Mm-hmm. And we're in the north of France, so we've obviously got a massive history here with textiles industry, there's pharmaceutical companies operating here, there's a lot of waste plants. And I just invite you, as I finish up, just to take a look at the Forever Pollution Project, which is a mapping project around Europe. And there are some 23,000 sites across Europe that they think are at high risk of PFAS pollution. And there are a lot of red dots in the north of France and in the Flanders region going to Belgium. So a lot of from that mapping project, potential contamination issues here in the north. So a lot to deal with. I think something we'll all be grappling with for a long time, as businesses, as lawyers, as people who live and drink water and eat food. So there are none of us here in this room or indeed anywhere that aren't affected by this. And yes, thank you very much for coming to listen to me talk about what sounds like a very niche topic, but actually is not at all when you come to think about it. I'm very happy to answer any questions.